They told me I stole my own father's love. They said 18 years in a military uniform was just an excuse. They said a woman like me couldn't make it in the real world. They put my name in the local paper next to words like predator and thief. And the man who said all of it, the man who smiled for the cameras while he said it, was my own brother. What nobody in that courtroom knew, what nobody could ever have guessed, was that the lawyer standing across from me had already met me before. Years earlier. In a place nobody ever talks about. My name is Maren Hawthorne. I am 38 years old. I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. And I had been home from my last mission for exactly 6 days when the server found me in a grocery store parking lot. I was holding a bag of oranges I never got to eat. I remember the weight of the envelope more than the words on it. Legal paper is heavy and stiff. It tells you, before you even open it, that your life is about to be turned upside down by people who never held a rifle at 3 a.m., wondering if the sun would rise on them again. I put the oranges down on the hood of my car. I opened the envelope right there, standing in the heat. And I read my brother's name typed neatly at the top. Caleb Hawthorne versus Maren Hawthorne. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was so exactly like him that laughing was the only thing that kept me from screaming in a parking lot full of strangers. Caleb is 46. He is my father's son from his first marriage. I am the daughter from the second one. The one who showed up when Caleb was already 8 years old. He was already sure by then that the world owed him something, because his mother had died young. I was 13 when our father got married again. I was a stranger in that house from the very first night. And Caleb made sure I always felt it. He never hit me. He never needed to. He had a way of looking straight through me at the dinner table. He used silence the way other people used cruelty. And it taught me faster than any drill sergeant ever could. It taught me how to make myself small. How to disappear in a room. How to live without needing anyone's approval. Maybe that is why the army felt like coming up for air. The complaint, when I finally sat down that night and read it all the way through, was almost impressive in how cruel it was. It called me an uneducated military woman. As if 18 years of leading soldiers and a graduate degree earned between combat trips meant nothing because I had done it in boots instead of a boardroom. It said I had used my father's weak mind against him. It said I had pushed him away from his only son. It said I had pressured a dying 74-year-old man into changing his will in my favor. Cutting Caleb out of the farm, the house, the savings, and the family trust our grandfather had started 60 years ago. I read it twice. Then I folded it, set it on the table, and went to bed. Because that is what 18 years of service teaches you. You don't fight the battle at midnight. You fight it when you are rested. When your hands have stopped shaking. 2 days later, Caleb went on the local morning show. I watched the video on my phone the next morning, my coffee going cold in my hand. He sat there in a blue suit that fit too well for a man who was supposed to be grieving his father. She spent her whole life in uniform, he said, because she couldn't survive in the real world. The host nodded along. Nobody in the studio asked Caleb a single hard question. Nobody asked why a man who had borrowed from our father's accounts 3 separate times, who had watched his real estate dreams fail twice, who had never once flown home when our father was in the hospital with pneumonia 2 winters ago, nobody asked why that man was the one wearing the face of a heartbroken son. I didn't post anything online. I didn't call a reporter. I didn't call Caleb. I let it sit. Because I learned something in combat that most civilians never get the chance to learn. The loudest voice in the room is very often the most scared one. And real silence scares people more than any argument ever could. But silence has a cost too. I saw it in the eyes of my neighbors at the mailbox. I saw it in the way a woman at the pharmacy suddenly found something urgent to do with her purse when she noticed my face from the news. I let them think I was weak. I let them think I had no answer. I had spent my whole career being underestimated by men who mistook my calm for a lack of will. And if there was one thing the army actually gave me, it was patience. The kind that outlasts anyone in a room. The morning of the hearing, I put on my dress uniform. Not because my lawyer told me to. Because I wanted to walk into that courtroom exactly as myself. No apology. No softening. Every ribbon on my chest exactly where it belonged. The courtroom smelled like old wood polish and nerves. I walked down the middle aisle, my boots quiet on the floor, and I felt every eye in the room follow me. Caleb's lawyer's chair was empty when I sat down. And then the side door opened. A tall man with silver hair walked in, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a thick leather folder. I knew just by looking at him that he carried everything meant to destroy me. He looked up. Our eyes met across the room. And something happened to his face that I will never forget. The color drained out of it. The folder slipped slightly in his grip. His mouth opened around a question he could not stop himself from asking. Even there. Even then. Even with a judge 2 feet away and my brother watching from across the aisle. It's really you. I didn't answer him. Not out loud. Not in that moment. I just held his gaze for one long second. Then I took my seat next to my own lawyer. I folded my hands the way I had been trained to fold them at attention. And I let the question hang in the air unanswered. Some things you don't explain in front of an audience. Some things you carry until the moment is right. But his face pulled me backward, the way a smell or a sound can drag you through years in a single second. And before the bailiff had even called the room to order, I was somewhere else entirely. I was 13 years old. Standing in the doorway of a house that had just become half mine and half a stranger's. My father married Vivian the summer I turned 13. I remember the wedding more as feelings than a single picture. The itch of a dress I didn't want to wear. The smell of flowers wilting in the July heat. My father's hand steady on my shoulder, as if he understood, even then, that I needed something to hold on to. What I remember most clearly is Caleb. He was 18. His arms were crossed at the back of the reception, watching the whole thing like a man watching his inheritance walk out the door in a white dress. He never said a cruel word in front of adults. He was smarter than that. Even young. But when it was just the two of us in that house, he had a gift for silence that could empty a room of air. He would look at me across the dinner table and then look away, like I wasn't worth the effort of being angry at. Only the effort of being dismissed. I learned to eat fast. I learned to disappear before dessert. I learned without anyone teaching me directly that love in that house was something rationed. And I had shown up too late to get my share. I signed up for the army the week after I turned 18. My father cried at the bus station, which surprised me because I hadn't known until that moment that he had even noticed me leaving. Caleb didn't come. He stayed home and said something about a business meeting he couldn't miss. And I remember feeling even then a strange and unwelcome relief. It was easier to go without having to watch his face not care. The years that followed were not kind to Caleb, though he would never have described them that way. He tried real estate first. A development outside Charlotte that collapsed before the foundations were even poured. And my father quietly wired him $40,000 to cover the losses, so the bank wouldn't come after the family name. Then came the restaurant 2 years later. And then the consulting firm that consisted, as far as I could tell, of Caleb mostly consulting with other people's wallets. Each time, my father paid. Each time, Vivian defended Caleb with the fierce love of a mother who had decided her son's failures were just misunderstood dreams. Each time, nobody told me. Because nobody ever told me anything about that house unless I asked. And by then, I had learned not to ask. I was overseas more often than not during those years. Georgia. Then Germany. Then deployment after deployment. Years stitched together by noisy phone calls and letters that arrived weeks after they were written. But I sent money home. Not because anyone asked me to. Because somewhere inside me, underneath the rank and the training, there was still a 13-year-old girl trying to prove she belonged in that family. Trying to earn a kind of love that should never have needed earning at all. I never told my father not to mention it to Caleb. I never had to. My father did that on his own. Quietly. The way he did most things that mattered. I found out only years later, from a bank paper he had left in an old filing cabinet, that he had kept a careful record. Money in from me. Money out to cover Caleb's losses. A careful counting of a family he was trying to hold together with numbers, because words had stopped working. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing your father knew exactly who you were. And chose for years not to say it out loud. Not because he didn't love me. Because loving me openly meant admitting to himself, and to Vivian, and to the world, that the son he had raised from birth had become someone he could no longer fully trust. And the daughter he had once worried about losing to a life in uniform had become the only one still standing beside him. I think that realization broke something loose in him eventually. In his last 2 years, after Vivian passed, when it was just the two of them, him and whatever version of Caleb kept circling back for help, I noticed a change in his letters. Less careful. Less like a man protecting a piece that no longer existed. He started asking about my career in a way that felt less like small talk and more like inventory. Like he was quietly weighing something. Turning it over. Deciding. I didn't know then what he was deciding. I found out the way the rest of the world found out. In a lawyer's office, in a room full of people who thought they already knew how the story would end. The reading of the will took place on a gray Tuesday in October, 11 days after we buried him. I remember the room more than I remember grieving properly that week. A conference room on the 4th floor of a law office downtown, with a long table too polished to be comfortable, and a view of a parking garage instead of sky. Vivian had passed 2 years earlier, so it was just Caleb, his wife Lydia, my father's longtime accountant Mr. Beasley, and me. I sat in a chair that felt too small for the weight of what was about to happen. The lawyer reading the will was not yet Julian Voss. That name meant nothing to any of us that afternoon. This was an older man named Harvey Collins, my father's estate lawyer for nearly 20 years. He had reading glasses perched low on his nose. And a voice that never wavered once as he worked through the will line by line. The farm went to me. 240 acres that had been in my father's family since long before Caleb or I existed. The house I barely lived in as a child, but still thought of as home every time I closed my eyes on deployment. The main house in town. The savings, modest but not small, built slowly over 4 decades by a man who never trusted the stock market further than he could see it. And control of the Hawthorne Family Trust, the small charity fund my grandfather had started, which mostly gave scholarships to kids from our county who wanted to serve. To Caleb, my father left $40,000 and a letter sealed to be opened in private. I watched Caleb's face change. The way ice changes when a crack begins somewhere you can't see, and then spreads before you understand what's happening. His jaw tightened first. Then his hand, flat on the table, curled slowly into something close to a fist. Lydia reached for his arm. He shook her off. Not violently. But with a kind of coldness that told me this conversation had already happened somewhere between them. Some version of it practiced for exactly this outcome. That's not possible, he said. His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. Read it again. Mr. Collins read it again. Nothing changed. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped backward against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have in that small room. He looked at me. Really looked at me. Maybe for the first time in years. And what I saw in his face wasn't grief. It was calculation. Fast and cold. A man already 3 moves ahead in a game the rest of us didn't know we were playing. She brainwashed him, he said. Not to me. To the room. To Mr. Collins. To Lydia. To anyone who might repeat it later. She's been gone half his life. And now she walks in and takes everything. I was here. I was here every week. I didn't say anything. I had learned a long time ago that explaining yourself to someone who has already made up their mind rarely changes the ending. It only gives them more material to twist. I sat with my hands folded on the table. The same posture I had held through 4 combat tours and 2 congressional briefings. And I let him finish. "I'm getting a lawyer," he said, jabbing a finger toward me like it was a weapon. "The best one in this city. We'll see how brainwashed a judge thinks he was." He was gone before I could respond. Lydia trailing behind him, her heels sharp and quick against the floor. And Mr. Collins closed the folder in front of him with a soft, tired sigh. The sigh of a man who had seen this very scene play out in this very room more times than he probably cared to count. Caleb didn't waste time. Within a week, word came through Mr. Beasley that Caleb had hired Julian Voss, the most feared trial lawyer in the state. A man with a reputation for turning even the most sympathetic juries against even the most sympathetic defendants. I remember hearing the name for the first time. I felt nothing but a kind of tired calm settle into my chest. The same feeling I used to get before a hard mission briefing. Not fear exactly. Just the recognition that something difficult was coming. And there was no version of the next few months that would be easy. What none of us knew, not Caleb, not Lydia, not even Julian Voss himself in that first week before he had so much as glanced at my name on the case file, was that he was about to spend his evenings preparing to tear apart a woman he had spent years trying to find. A woman he owed. A debt he had never been able to repay, because he had never been able to find her. He read through the complaint his own client had written. He read the accusations. Manipulation. Undue pressure. Exploitation of a vulnerable old man. And something in the language must have bothered him. Some instinct built over 30 years of courtroom work that told him the facts didn't quite add up. But he had a client. He had a case. And he had not yet seen my face. That would come later. In a courtroom on a morning neither of us would ever forget. Julian Voss had built his career on a simple, brutal gift. He could read a person before they finished their first sentence. 31 years in courtrooms across the state had given him an instinct for the moment a witness's story started to crack. The half-second pause before a lie. The quiet stillness of someone telling the truth and knowing no one will believe them anyway. He walked into the first hearing that morning with every intention of doing exactly what Caleb Hawthorne was paying him to do. He had the complaint memorized. He had a plan mapped out in his head. Show the age and weakness of the dead father. Cast doubt on the timing of the will changes. Suggest that a decorated soldier's long absence from her father's daily life made her an unlikely choice for his full trust. It was not a case built on love. It was a case built on architecture. And Julian Voss built legal architecture better than almost anyone alive. Then the side door of the courtroom opened, and Maren Hawthorne walked in wearing her dress uniform. And the entire structure he had spent 2 weeks building in his mind simply stopped existing. He told me later that his first thought wasn't recognition. It was a kind of vertigo. The feeling of a name and a face refusing to line up with the 18 years that had passed between them. But then she turned her head just slightly, the way she must have turned it 1,000 times, giving orders in places he could only imagine. And the vertigo turned into certainty. So total it nearly buckled his knees. He was back in a compound outside a city whose name still, to this day, made his chest tight. He was a young legal officer then, attached to a unit doing work he wasn't cleared to fully understand. He was sent overseas not to fight, but to make sure the people who did fight stayed within the lines the law demanded. Even in places where the lines themselves felt like a cruel joke. His daughter Sophie, 24 years old and young in the special way only 24-year-olds can be, was there too. Working with an aid group handing out supplies to a refugee camp 3 miles from where he was stationed. He hadn't wanted her there. He had said so more than once in arguments that ended with her reminding him that his job was to advise soldiers, not parent a grown woman. The attack came on an ordinary Tuesday. Which is somehow the detail that stayed with him most clearly over the years. Not the violence of it, but how ordinary the morning had been. Coffee. Paperwork. Sophie texting him a photo of a child she had been playing with the day before. The reports that came in afterward were broken up and messy. The kind of chaos that makes clean stories impossible to build, even years later. What he knew for sure was this. Gunfire. A convoy caught in the open. Casualties on both sides. And somewhere in the middle of it, a young army captain who had no reason to be anywhere near that convoy, running back through open ground twice to pull civilians to safety. One of those civilians was his daughter. He didn't learn the captain's name that day. Military reports in the first days after something like that are careful on purpose. Thin on details. By the time he thought to try to find the soldier who had run through gunfire for a stranger's daughter, she had already been reassigned. Already vanished into the giant, unnamed machine of the army. The way soldiers who don't want to be found always seem to manage. He tried. For almost 2 years after coming home, he tried. Letters. Calls. A request through a friend who owed him a favor. Every trail went cold. He told himself it was because she didn't want to be found. And he made himself respect that, even though respecting it felt like swallowing glass. Every single year on the anniversary of the attack, when Sophie called him just to say she was alive and well and raising 2 kids of her own now in Ohio. He never told Caleb any of this. There was no reason to. It had never occurred to him that the 2 threads of his life, his gratitude for a stranger and his duty to a paying client, might ever meet in a courtroom on an ordinary Tuesday morning. But there she was. He would describe it to me later as the strangest 30 seconds of his professional life. Standing in front of a judge. Opposing counsel. His own client. Holding a folder full of arguments designed to paint a war hero as a thief with a heart of stone. While the war hero herself sat 20 feet away. And he understood, with total and immediate clarity, that he had no idea what he was really looking at. He did not drop the case that day. I'll be honest about that. He didn't throw everything down in some dramatic gesture the moment he recognized me. He was a professional. And professionals don't give up on clients based on a feeling. However strong that feeling was. He sat through the hearing. He said what he had prepared to say. But that night, alone in his office long after his staff had gone home, he pulled the case file back out and read it again. This time not as a lawyer building a case, but as a man looking very carefully for the truth he suddenly needed to know. He started with the emails. Caleb had given him a packet of messages as evidence. Emails that supposedly showed my father Thomas, confused and upset, worried about Marin taking over everything, dated across the last 8 months of his life. Julian had glanced at them before. Satisfied that they helped his client's story. Now, reading them slowly, with the careful attention of a man who no longer trusted the person who had handed them to him, he noticed something that turned his stomach. The formatting was wrong. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way a judge flipping through the pages would catch. But wrong in the way a forger's small overconfidence always shows itself to someone who knows exactly what to look for. Email headers carry more information than most people realize. Timestamps. Server routes. Hidden data that survives even when the visible words have been changed. Julian had a tech expert he trusted. A woman named Sasha who had helped him win 3 cases involving digital evidence. And he sent her the files that same night with a short message that gave nothing away. Her answer came back before 9 the next morning. 4 of the 6 emails had been edited after their original send dates. 2 showed signs of being built from pieces of real messages stitched together. Phrases moved out of context to build sentences. My father Thomas had never actually written them in that order. Julian sat with that for a long time before he called Caleb. He didn't say what he had found. Not yet. He asked instead where the emails had come from. Who had access to my father's old computer after his death? Whether anyone else had helped prepare the paperwork for the case. Caleb's answers came too fast. Too smooth. The answers of a man who had practiced them long before anyone asked. Julian had questioned enough liars in 31 years to know the difference between a man remembering and a man acting out memory. And Caleb was acting. The recordings bothered him even more. Caleb had given him an audio clip 4 minutes long, supposedly a phone call between my father and his hospice social worker, in which my father could be heard saying in a slurred, confused voice that he didn't know what Marin was making him sign. Sasha's analysis came back within 2 days. The audio had been put together from at least 3 separate recordings. Spliced at points. Made to be almost impossible to hear with the ear. My father's real words, about a completely different matter, stitched back together into a sentence he had never spoken. Then came the witness. A woman named Nora Quinn, listed as a former home health aide. She claimed to have seen me pressuring my father during a visit in his last year. Julian called the agency listed on her work papers. They had no record of her. He called the number Caleb had given him for her. It rang twice and disconnected. When he finally reached her 3 days later through another way, she admitted slowly that Lydia had approached her at a diner and offered her $8,000 for her testimony, coaching her through exactly what to say on the stand. The last piece was the ugliest. Buried in a stack of money papers Julian's assistant had pulled for background, there were loan records. 3 separate loans my father Thomas had made to Caleb over the past 9 years. Each one carefully signed and stamped. Each one never paid back. Adding up to just under $200,000. Caleb had told Julian in their very first meeting that he had never asked his father for a single dollar. Julian had believed him. Now he understood that everything Caleb had told him from the very beginning had been built with the same care as the doctored emails. Plausible. Polished. And completely false. He called Caleb into his office on a Thursday evening. Just the 2 of them. The city going dark outside the window behind Julian's desk. He laid the papers out one at a time. Not raising his voice. Not putting on a show. Just placing evidence on the table, the way he had placed evidence in front of 1,000 witnesses over his career. The emails were changed, he said. The recording was cut together. Your witness was paid to lie under oath. And you owe your father $200,000 you never told me anything about. He looked up. If this is true, and I have every reason to believe it is, we are done. I will not build a case on lies. Caleb didn't deny it. Not directly. That was the part that stayed with Julian longest. He told me Caleb never once said it wasn't true. He said other things instead. He said Marin didn't deserve the farm. He said their father had never understood what it cost him to stay. To be the son who showed up in person, while Marin hid behind a uniform on the other side of the world. He said the end mattered more than the means. That fairness sometimes needed a little push to get where it was supposed to be. Julian listened to all of it without interrupting. When Caleb finished, Julian closed the folder in front of him and said, very quietly, that he would be filing a motion to step down as Caleb's lawyer within the week. And that Caleb would be wise to find new help fast. Because whatever happened next, Julian Voss would not be the one standing beside him. Caleb left his office that night, still sure Julian had done nothing wrong. That belief would not survive very much longer. The motion to withdraw hit the court records on a Monday morning. And by the time the courtroom met again 2 weeks later, the story had already started leaking through the county. The way these things always do in a place small enough that everyone knows someone who knows someone. I heard it first from Mr. Beasley, who called me sounding almost giddy. A tone I had never once heard from a man whose entire professional manner was careful, measured calm. He dropped him, Beasley said. Voss dropped Caleb right there in open court. I didn't feel triumph when I heard it. I felt something quieter. More like the release of a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding since that morning in the parking lot with the oranges. I had spent weeks getting ready for a long, ugly fight. The kind where truth moves slower than lies, and good names get torn apart long before verdicts ever arrive. I hadn't let myself imagine an ending that came this fast, or this clean. When the courtroom filled again, Caleb sat alone at the defense table. Except for a new lawyer. A younger man, clearly drowning in a case file he had inherited only days before. flipping through papers with the terrified energy of someone trying to build a raft in the middle of a flood. Julian sat in the gallery now. Not at the lawyer table. Only there as a witness the court had called once the fraud claims came out. I caught his eye once, briefly, before the judge called the room to order. He gave me the smallest nod. The kind that says more than any speech could. The witnesses came one after another that day. And each one chipped away another piece of the story Caleb had spent months building. My father's doctor testified first. He walked the court through 18 months of medical records that showed no diagnosis of fading memory. No medicine that would have hurt his thinking. Nothing but a 74-year-old managing arthritis and mild high blood pressure with the same stubborn clarity he had carried his whole life. The accountant who had helped my father rework his savings 2 years before his death testified that Thomas had asked careful, informed questions in every meeting. Had pushed back on ideas he didn't agree with. Had been, in his words, one of the most clear-headed clients I have ever worked with in 20 years. Then came Mr. Collins, the original estate lawyer. He described the day my father had come into his office alone, without me, without anyone, and asked to change his will. Collins testified that he had met with Thomas on 4 separate occasions over 6 weeks. That he had required, as he always did with older clients, an independent capacity check before finalizing any changes. And that the check had come back clear. My father understood exactly what he was doing. He had explained his reasons to Collins in detail. Not with anger toward Caleb, Collins said. But with a kind of tired sadness. The sadness of a man who had spent years covering for a son who never once said thank you. The bank records came next. Entered without protest, since Caleb's new lawyer had no ground left to fight them on. 3 loans. $200,000. Every payment plan broken. Every promise unkept. And then, in what I understood later was the moment that broke whatever was left of Caleb's composure, the court played the security video from my father's home office, recovered from a camera system Caleb himself hadn't known still existed. Installed years earlier after a break-in scare, and mostly forgotten since. It showed a date 11 months before my father's death. It showed Caleb sitting across the desk from him. Leaning forward. His voice audible, even through the small built-in microphone, saying words that needed no translation from any lawyer in that room. You have to fix this before it's too late, Dad. Before she talks you into something you will regret. My father's response, quiet but clear, cut through the courtroom like something physical. The only person talking me into anything, son, is you. Right now. In this room. I watched Caleb's face while that recording played. I watched Lydia's hand find his arm again. And this time, he didn't shake her off. I watched something in him finally and visibly collapse. Not into regret. Not yet. But into the particular exhaustion of a man who has run out of new lies to tell. The judge didn't take long to rule. The will stood. Untouched. Unchallenged. The court found, in words I still remember almost word for word, that the evidence powerfully showed Thomas Hawthorne's full mental ability and his clear, deliberate intent. And that the plaintiff had, through his own actions and through the actions of the people he had hired, tried to cheat the court with made-up evidence and paid for lies. The judge sent the case to the district attorney for further investigation. Caleb didn't look at me as the ruling was read. He stared straight ahead at some point on the wall behind the judge's desk. His jaw tight. His hands flat on the table in front of him. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something other than distance when I looked at him. I felt sorry for him. Not enough to change anything. But enough to understand that he had spent his whole life chasing a version of our father's love that had never actually been taken away from him. Only offered in a different shape than he wanted. And he had burned everything down trying to force it into a shape it was never going to take. The courthouse steps were still damp from an early rain when I walked out that afternoon. And Julian was waiting for me at the bottom. His hands in his coat pockets. Looking older somehow than he had in the courtroom. As if the weight he had been carrying for years had finally settled into his shoulders now that he could set it down. "I have waited a long time to say this properly," he said. His voice was not the courtroom voice anymore. Not the sharp, measured voice. It was quieter. Rougher around the edges. "I have waited years to thank you." I told him he didn't owe me anything. I meant it. What I did that day overseas wasn't a deal. Wasn't something I ever expected to be paid back for. And standing there on those wet steps, I almost felt embarrassed by how strong his gratitude was. The way you get embarrassed when someone insists on thanking you for something that, in the moment, just felt like the only decent thing a person could do. But he shook his head. And he told me about Sophie. Sophie was 31 now. Married. 2 kids. Living outside Columbus. Working as a pediatric nurse. A career she had told him more than once she chose because of what happened that day. Because surviving had taught her something about how fragile life is. About second chances. And she wanted to spend her life honoring that. He showed me a photo on his phone. A little girl with the same stubborn jaw as Sophie. And something in my chest loosened in a way I hadn't expected. A knot I hadn't fully known I had been carrying, since I walked away from that convoy years ago without ever learning what became of the woman I had pulled to safety. "If you hadn't gone back," he said. And then he stopped. Because some sentences don't need finishing. And we both knew it. We didn't stay long on those steps. There wasn't much more to say that wouldn't have cheapened what had already been said. And Julian, for all his courtroom grace, seemed to understand that better than most people would have. He shook my hand. He told me to call if I ever needed anything. And he walked off toward a car waiting at the curb. A man carrying something lighter than he had carried in years. Caleb was charged 3 weeks later. Fraud. Evidence tampering. Paying a witness to lie under oath. The district attorney's office moved faster than I expected. Faster than Caleb's new lawyer seemed ready for. I didn't take pleasure in it the way I thought I might. I had spent so many months bracing for a fight. That when the fight finally ended, what I felt wasn't victory. It was a kind of stillness. The quiet that comes after a long deployment, when your body finally understands it's allowed to rest. I went back to the farm the following weekend. Alone. For the first time since the funeral. The house was exactly as my father had left it. His reading glasses still on the side table. A coffee mug still in the drying rack. The special silence of a home that hasn't yet learned how to be empty. I walked through each room slowly, touching things I hadn't touched since I was a girl. And in the study, tucked into a drawer of his desk, exactly where Mr. Collins had told me it would be, I found the letter. It wasn't long. My father was never a man of many words. Not on paper. Not out loud. And the letter read more like something spoken quietly across a kitchen table than something written for later. Marin. I know what they will say about the will. I know what your brother will say. And I know some of it will hurt. Because that is what family does, even when it doesn't mean to. I want you to know I thought about this for a long time. Longer than anyone knows. I watched you carry more than you ever let on. For longer than you should have had to. And I never found the right way to tell you that I saw it. This is the only way I knew how. People will remember what I left you. I hope one day they will understand why. Love always. Dad. I sat with that letter for a long time in the fading afternoon light. The farm quiet around me. The way it is quiet only in places that have belonged to the same family for generations. Where the silence itself seems to carry the shape of everyone who ever lived there. I thought about the 13-year-old girl who had stood in a doorway feeling like a stranger in her own home. I thought about every deployment, every letter sent and unanswered, every dollar wired home without explanation, because explanation had never been the point. I thought about a man I had pulled through gunfire on the other side of the world. And the daughter he raised. And the strange, unlikely thread that had connected all of it back to this farmhouse. This desk. This letter. I don't know if Caleb will ever understand what our father was trying to tell him in his own private letter. The one I have never asked to read and never will. Some things aren't mine to know. But I know what I understand now. Sitting in that study with the last light coming through the window the way it used to when I was young enough to still believe that every room in that house belonged to me. I understand that inheritance was never really about the farm. Or the money. Or the trust. It was about being seen. My father saw me. Finally. Completely. Even if it took him most of a lifetime to find the words for it. And whatever else this year cost me, the headlines, the accusations, the brother I may never fully get back, I walked out of that house for the first time in longer than I could remember, feeling exactly what my father must have felt. Every single day he sat at that desk, quietly making sure I knew, in the only language he had left, that I was loved. If this story moved you, I would love to know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below, because stories like this one deserve to travel as far as the people who feel them. We share stories like this every single day here on Twisted Family Revenge Stories. Raw stories about families torn apart, and sometimes quietly put back together. And if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and hit subscribe now. Let's keep walking through these stories together.